Hello and welcome to this presentation on the 1988 Education Reform Act. My name's Carl. I run the website revisesociology.com where you can find all your revision needs for A-level sociology. And in this presentation we are going to look at the key ideas of the new right, 5 specific policies and some evaluations. This content has primarily been written for the AQA A-Level Sociology specification, although the content might be more broadly relevant. And the 1988 Education Act is the most important act you need to know about because it's shaped policy ever since. And immediately after this, you will probably study New Labour's policies, then the Coalition's, and then the Tories' education policies since 2015. The 1988 Education Act was introduced by the New Right, who were a conservative government which incorporated neoliberal ideas. We're not going to worry about the difference between the New Right and neoliberalism for now. There's a lot of overlap. And the main idea behind the 1988 Education Act was to tackle what the then conservative government saw as an inefficient state-run education system. There were a lot of low-standard schools back in the early 1980s, and the hope was that by making schools compete with each other, that would drive up standards overall. And 2 key principles worked together in order to raise standards in the eyes of the Tories. The first was parentocracy, giving students and parents the right to choose schools, and also marketisation, making schools compete for pupils in the same way that businesses compete for customers. So marketisation means creating an education market. And you've probably heard of Margaret Thatcher. She was the most well-known face of neoliberalism and the New Right in the 1980s in Britain. So to my mind, there are 5 key policies of the 1988 Education Act: league tables, Ofsted, open enrolment, which is parental choice, formula funding, linking the amount of funding a school gets to the amount of pupils it has, and finally the national curriculum. And all of these ideas work together to make schools compete for pupils. And we might take all of these for granted today, but before 1988 none of this existed, which might sound strange now, but it really was the case. And this education system is the one we've really got today. This is so fundamental in changing things. So from 1988, schools were required to publish their exam results and the progress that each student made from when they got into the school to when they left. And I mean, back in the day in 1988, these would have been, league tables would have been paper documents. But with the wonderful world of the internet, these have evolved massively. So you can now just type in a postcode area and find out where the different schools in an area rank. And Ofsted is the body which inspects schools. Now typically an Ofsted inspection will last 3 to 5 days, and a bunch of Ofsted inspectors go in, they observe lessons, they interview staff, they interview pupils, and a school gets a brief report outlining the strengths and limitations, and they get a grade from outstanding to needs improvement. Technically Ofsted was introduced in the early 1990s, by the way, but I'm including it under 1988 because it's fundamental. And the Ofsted report is another way that parents can find out information about a school and make a judgment about choice. So today, parents can express a preference for the school they want their kid to go to. Yeah, believe it or not, before the 1980s, it was local education authorities that decided where children went, and they would just send them to the local school close to where their parents lived. So 1988 really changed that. And formula funding is, it might sound like a bizarre idea that this is necessary, but basically nowadays schools get funding per pupil. Now what was happening back in the 1970s was that local education authorities would get a budget, they would then give this to schools. And what some local education authorities did is they would give more money to failing schools in order to try and help them make up for their failures. So you would end up with this bizarre situation where a failing school or a lower standard school might be getting more money per pupil than a successful school. And the Tories thought that was a bit ridiculous. The idea is the money should flow to the schools that are doing well, and then with everything else in place, you can set up a system whereby those better schools get more pupils and can expand, and the failing schools just kind of wither and either wither and die, or today they get taken over by outstanding schools and academy chains. But all of that better schools taken over with worse schools, that didn't happen in the early 80s or the early 90s. This has been an evolution of the education system since. And the national curriculum introduced in 1988, yeah, believe it or not, prior to 88 schools could pretty much teach what they wanted. But the national curriculum made all schools focus on 8 core subjects basically. And this is necessary in order to be able to compare schools, because schools need to be teaching to the same exams so you can actually rank them against each other. So a couple of questions you might want to think about. So what policies did 88 introduce to raise standards? And what were the strengths of the 1988 Education Act compared to the previous comprehensive system? So now we're going to move on to evaluations and look at some of the strengths and limitations. So in terms of the strengths, the Act laid the foundation up to the present day. So successive governments haven't really changed the fundamentals that the 1988 Act introduced. We've still got league tables, still got Ofsted, still got open enrolment, formula funding, and the national curriculum. And the main aim of the Act was to improve standards, and results have improved since 1988. And eventually the system evolved to allow for failing schools to be taken over by more successful ones. And also, marketisation at least gave middle-class parents more choice. Not so much working-class parents, but there are a lot of strengths, and we have to recognise these. And this is just a slide showing the gradual improvement in GCSE results. So I grouped the criticisms into 3 main elements. So firstly, there's problem with league tables, in that when you get league tables that specify certain content, schools end up teaching to the test. That is, they spend more time training students how to pass tests rather than broadening the curriculum and teaching them more content. And it can be stressful as well. And actually, since 1988, there's been less and less focus on testing over the years, so the government's recognised this. Secondly, the system seems to have advantaged middle-class parents more than working-class parents. The easiest way to understand this is that the best schools have got like a limited catchment area, and so what's happened is that the house prices near to those schools in those catchment areas have gone up, and there's a premium of several tens of thousands of pounds on those houses, and so richer parents can afford to move closer to schools with better results because they've got more money basically. And there's possibly been some increasing inequality as the best schools cream skim the best students and get better, and the worst schools just kind of sink to the bottom, the worst schools tending to be in more working class and deprived areas. And yeah, too much testing is probably the easiest criticism to remember, and teachers have been very, very critical of testing, but as I said, there's been less testing since the 1990s, and that's an evolution. So conclusions, did the new rights policies raise standards? Yes, but there's teaching to the test, a lot of stress and increased inequality. Did the new rights policies improve equality? And really no, the middle classes have used their material and cultural capital to benefit more from marketisation. And finally, to find out more, please visit revisesociology.com. There's a lot more depth in the blog post there. I will drop some specific links in the box below. And this material is relevant to the educational policies topic. 1988 is the main policy. And after this, you'll go on to look at New Labour, the coalition, and maybe the pandemic and education policy. Okay, thanks for listening.